And now that we know that, it seems generally implausible that this just happened, that things of this level of complexity just happen. And so, but then there's something else related. I just want to get this out of the way before we leap into your book. But explain this concept of irreducible complexity.
Right. The case for intelligent design is not so much made in the negative as, well, it's so complex it couldn't have arisen by an undirected process. It's really made in the affirmative by noting features in living organisms that we know from experience are produced by one and only one type of cause. One of those features is digital information. Okay, and that's the argument that I've developed. Mike Behe has developed a separate argument from the presence of a feature that engineers recognize. Engineers sometimes talk about integrated complexity.
Right.
Behe calls it irreducible complexity. And that is a feature of systems wherein you have a great number of parts.
Right.
And if you remove any one of those parts, the whole system ceases to function.
Right, so it could not have evolved. It's not a gradual process. It had to be put together or it wouldn't work.
The intermediate stages on the way, he makes famous this little, and I kid you not, it's a rotary engine that's inside the cell wall of bacterium. It's called a bacterial flagellar motor. It's high-tech and low-life. And it's got it's made of 30 protein parts. It has O-rings, bushings, a drive shaft, a hook-like propeller, or a protein that functions like a propeller, and it rotates at 100,000 RPM, can change direction on a quarter turn. It's an amazing machine. And what has been discovered by the biochemists working on this machine is that the 29-part, the 28-part, the 27-part version of this is non-viable. It doesn't perform any function. Darwin said that natural selection selects for functional advantage. It preserves those things that pass on an advantage in the competition for survival. Well, these intermediate stages have no functional advantage, and so you couldn't build this up gradually, and that's a big part of his argument.
I want to ask you about your book. Do you mind?
Not at all.
Because we've got a lot of copies here. We've got to move some product. The book has done well. It's very, very impressive. It's called Darwin's Doubt. Tell us, what does that title mean?
Well, Darwin, in contrast to the rhetorical excess of some of the modern neo-Darwinists, Richard Dawkins, if you find someone who's skeptical about evolution, they're either ignorant, stupid, wicked, or insane. You know?
Right, or one of his ex-wives, who were all of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. But they taught me in acting class back in high school to let the laughter dissipate. But I wasn't saying anything funny. Anyway, he said that we were talking about Dawkins.
I have no idea.
I lost the thread.
He's got, I think Melba was the third wife.
Yeah.
And let me see. Oh, I know. You were saying, yes,
Doubt.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Darwin's Doubt. It's a book you wrote, I
right.
think, yeah.
In contrast to Dawkins and crew, Darwin was actually very modest in his expression. He acknowledged difficulties with his theory, and he had a very significant doubt about one particular class of evidence. It was called an event in the history of life called the Cambrian Explosion.
Okay, so what is the Cambrian Explosion? You were probably just going to tell us, yeah.
The Cambrian Explosion is the geologically abrupt or sudden or discontinuous appearance of most of the major groups of animals in the fossil record.
And this happened around 580 million years ago?
About 530 million is the...
Oh, you say 5, I say 580.
Yeah.
But, so in other words, that evolution was not a smooth process, or whatever happened, the change of life forms was not a smooth process. The Cambrian Explosion says that suddenly, roughly 530 million years ago, wham, all kinds of things happened.
All kinds of really...
It was not gradual, and that's why they call it an
Exactly.
explosion.
And remember that second definition of evolution was the idea of gradual evolution, as represented by the tree of life.
Very slow.
So right out of the chute, you've got something that's challenging one of the meanings of Darwin's theory. It also challenged his idea of natural selection. And he called them natural selection and random variations, because he envisioned the mechanism of natural selection and random variation working very slowly and gradually. He recognized that if there were big changes from one generation to another, you get deformed organisms. So the changes had to be very small and incremental, which meant the process needed a great deal of time. And what he saw, and yet what he saw in the fossil record, was this abrupt appearance of these major groups.
Darwin saw this.
So
even in his day, he saw this.
Right. Now, he expected and hoped that the subsequent fossil finds would fill in those big gaps.
Right.
But as I show in the book, the gaps have gotten more pronounced, and the discontinuity is more pervasive.
Okay, so yes, as time has passed, since Darwin,
Right.
the fossil record has in fact shown the opposite of what he hoped.
The ancestral precursors have not turned up in the pre-Cambrian layers. And in the Cambrian, we've discovered many more exotic creatures with lots of intricate organs and structures and body plans that were unknown to Darwin that have been discovered in that same seam of rock all the way around the world. The most dramatic finds of which are in the Burgess Shale in Canada and an amazing find in southern China in the last couple decades.
So what are...
So the explosion has become more explosive, basically.
Okay. How frightening.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so why is the book titled Darwin's Doubt? He saw this?
He saw this, and what the book does is tell the story of that doubt, and it traces that doubt up to modern times and shows that the problem that Darwin recognized has become more acute in two different respects. First, the fossil missing, what I call the mystery of the missing fossils, has become more acute as we've discovered all these new forms of Cambrian life, and all of which are also missing ancestral forms. But the second mystery that I address in the book is, I think, a deeper mystery. It's essentially an engineering problem. And so the second part of the book is subtitled How to Build an Animal. And what we now know about the centrality and importance of information, both digital information and other forms of information, to building animals, poses this really difficult problem. How can natural selection acting on these random changes, random mutations, generate whole new stretches of functional genetic code? Imagine a computer program that's performing an important function in your computer, and then imagine randomly changing the digital bits. Then ask yourself a question. Are you more likely to, by doing that, produce a whole new operating system or computer program, or are you more likely to degrade the information that's already there? Since the 1960s, there's been an immense skepticism among mathematicians, computer scientists, and other engineers about the efficacy, the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, because they don't see how random changes in typographic characters is going to generate whole new functional sequences of information.
So, but if there is debate among people in the academy about these kinds of things, why are some scientists, or why is the establishment so dismissive of intelligent design? In other words, what is the internal debate, and how does that play out?
Well, I think it's hard to speculate about the motives that people have for some of the extreme reactions that they offer to this. But I think what you put your finger on before about the prior philosophical commitment to a materialistic form of science is one of the reasons. Because this idea that there is a purpose of intelligence behind some of these key features we see in life clearly challenges the matter, the materialist view. It's a mind over matter view of reality.
In other words, the internal critics, people who are saying this doesn't make sense, are not saying, well, we think we've got a solution, there's an intelligence behind this. Instead, what they're saying is, we don't know, and we assume there's a materialist answer that will reveal itself.
I got a very interesting letter from a very prominent scientist. I won't mention him by name now, but...
What are his initials?
You did that trick once tonight. Yeah. And it was after the publication of the first book, Signature in the Cell, and he said, I entirely agree with the scientific analysis you've done. Even the RNA world, which was the hot chemical evolutionary idea, he said is going nowhere, and everyone knows it. He said, and I'd like to say more publicly about your book, but he said, I'm committed to a materialistic solution to this problem. So your science is right, but we differ philosophically, was what he was saying. And I think that is actually the basis of a lot of the difference. This is a very cordial and respectful guy, but a lot of the people who are not, I think they're less aware of their own materialistic premises in the way they're conducting science.
Well, those of us who are non-scientists, and I'm an extreme non-scientist, are really unaware of the debate within the world of science and other disciplines. It's not the sort of thing one reads about in the New York Times or wherever. It's just not the kind of thing that we would normally be made aware of or would be aware of. And there's this general sense in the culture, I think, that this has all been decided and figured out, and there isn't much debate. That the science is settled, so to speak, and move along. There's nothing to talk about.
That's what got me into it. When I was at a particular conference where the problems in origin of life studies, chemical evolutionary theory, were being discussed, and I had, after 2 science majors as an undergraduate, been under the impression that all the science was settled. But it's far more interesting than that. In the new book, one of the themes, I tell a mystery story, but there's a kind of a journalistic expose involved in the story as well, because I show that there's a huge disparity between the public presentation of the status of modern Darwinian theory by people at the New York Times or in all the major science organizations have committees that make pronouncements on this, by the public spokesman for the theory like Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne. So there's a huge disparity between what they say and how they present the theory to the public and what's going on in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And by that, I don't just mean biology generally. I'm even talking about evolutionary biology. And one of the things I do in the book is I look at there are 6 new theories of evolutionary biology that have been proposed in just the last few years by scientists who are breaking with the textbook orthodoxy of neo-Darwinism. Some of them are openly calling for a new theory of evolution precisely because they recognize that the mutation, natural selection, lacks the creative power that has long been attributed to it.
Let me simply say, wow. That's pretty amazing, actually.
Well, it's a story that hasn't been told.
Well, I mean, none of this is told. I was amazed just a few years ago. I wrote a book of apologetics, and I was looking into some of this, and I was staggered to find that some of the stuff that I took as gospel truth. I mean, most of us in school someplace saw the famous Heckle Drawings. The ontology recapitulates phylogeny, which shows that in embryo form, all these different animals look exactly the same, and it shows that that we sort of we come from a common ancestor or whatever. And I learned that those drawings, which are so famous and ingrained in so many of our minds, were basically fudged and are no longer accepted. And I was just amazed because it's finding out that Pluto is not a planet, which I just did.
Yeah. That's right. And oddly, in that case, they were known to be fraudulent since 1894. The famous Cambridge embryologist Adam Sedgwick had exposed that almost a century ago. Stephen Jay Gould thought this was just an appalling recycling of bad science in our textbooks. So
I mean, yeah. I mean, 1894. I was not in school then. It is pretty amazing. The same thing with the famous, I don't know if it's still there, at the Museum of Natural History, the Eohippus. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The horse sequence.
The horse sequence. I don't even know if that's still there anymore, but it seems that it was the same kind of thing, basically fudged, that it's not necessarily something that happened. I mean, any of this kind of stuff was big news to me, I have to say. And then the idea that there are these big gaps in the fossil record, also not exactly something that's taught in the schools, at least not where I went to school.
Well, and what you're finding in the peer-reviewed literature is this engineering problem, as I refer to it, is really what is generating a lot of skepticism among evolutionary biologists, because the complexity of these systems. Let me try one little technical argument and see if we can make this clear. It's really fascinating to me. There are these. To build an animal, it turns out that you not only need all this genetic information, but there are circuits. And these circuits are crucial to getting the right cells to differentiate from each other and go to the right place as you're building an animal as it unfolds from embryo to adult. But there's a problem. As we've done, as developmental biologists have done experiments on this circuitry, they're called developmental gene regulatory networks, they find that even modest alterations in these circuits have catastrophic effects. But to build a new animal, you need new types of circuitry to make sure that the cells in the other type of animal get to their right places. So to build one animal form from another, you need a new type of circuit, but you can't alter the original circuit without destroying the animal during its development. And you have these kinds of problems. I look at 4 or 5 of these types of really intractable engineering problems confronting the evolutionary mechanism. And it's one of the reasons that so many top-line evolutionary biologists are themselves looking for a new approach. Not necessarily intelligent design, but they're saying this neo-Darwinian approach is failing us.
Well, before we go to the Q&A, I just want to ask you a couple quick things. But the first one, I guess, is where do you see all of this going? Because when you have this paleontologist from Holyoke saying that your book is a game changer, there seem to be, cracks in the dam. It seems clear that this unified front is not as unified as it once was, and it seems to me that there's a possibility of some shifting around. But what do you see? Is there hope that people in the academy might accept some of this? I mean, it seems hard for me to believe, but I'm just getting some signs of hope. So I'm curious, from your point of view, what do you think?
Well, I think it's actually very exciting. We're not hearing about a lot of it in the media, and I think the metaphor you used of attempting to kill the baby in the bassinet was, exactly right. In the 2004, 2005, when the work on intelligent design broke into the public awareness through the media, there was that big trial in Dover, and Wired magazine did a cover story on us, and a lot of media attention. The official media line narrative was, this is a faith-based idea. Time magazine had a cover story, and that was a faith-based idea. But the idea is actually based on science, scientific evidence, and a scientific method of reasoning. And what we're now finding is that there is a growing subterranean dissent against Darwinism. And many of those scientists are getting in contact with us. And there's a growing network internationally of scientists who are contributing to this intelligent design research program. We've talked mainly about how the evidence might point to a designer or how it might challenge Darwinian evolution. But once you're convinced that life is a design system, it leads to experiments and a different way of looking at life that may have what scientists call heuristic value. It may lead to new discoveries. One of the predictions that we made, for example, that was different than the Darwinian prediction was the prediction about so-called junk DNA. And last fall, it was confirmed by this massive ENCODE project that the junk DNA, which was thought to be the detritus, the leftovers from the trial and error mutation selection process, turned out to be importantly functional, just as the ID proponents had predicted. So we think this leads to in really fruitful directions for new science, and we're seeing an awful lot of scientists coming to us, oddly, especially Europeans. Some very high-profile European scientists have sort of joined ranks, and so I think there's I'm very optimistic that this materialistic ideology is losing its stranglehold on the practice of science.
I'm aware of the junk DNA findings because I follow Discovery on Twitter. I just want to say that. And yes, I do. And I guess I want to ask what is Francis Collins's view of the junk DNA story? Do you know? I mean, where does he come out on that?
He wrote a book in 2006, The Language of God, in which he made some arguments for the second meaning of evolution, common descent, based on the non-functionality of certain genes that were present with us and present with chimps. And the argument is, look, if these things aren't performing a function and they're present in...
Like an appendix, right? I mean,
yeah, something like that, only at the genetic level.
To break it down for us, like an appendix. Yeah. It has no use, but it just ended up there because that's what happened. And clearly,
it wouldn't happen
God
twice,
would not design us with an appendix. Why would he do such a thing?
Yeah, and you wouldn't have two...
And now that you're here, why would he?
And the idea is you wouldn't have in two different organisms two essentially broken genes that aren't doing anything unless they had a common ancestor. And since Collins wrote that book in 2006, a lot of this has come out. Some of it under his direction. He's had his name on a number of these scientific papers that have established the functionality of many of these allegedly broken genes or sections of junk DNA. So I think a lot of those arguments have to be reassessed. And it's an interesting dynamic area of scientific conversation. But clearly the main Darwinian argument, I mean, I got this right before I published Signature in the Cell. There were people writing papers saying, well, if the genome is designed, if the information in DNA points to an intelligent designer, why is so much of the genome junk?
Right.
And it turned out not to be so. In fact, what's fascinating to me is that overall those non-protein coding regions of the genome are not junk at all, but they function much like an operating system in a computer that are regulating the expression of the data files. They're regulating the timing and expression of the information that does build proteins. So what we're looking at is a really sophisticated information processing system in even the very simplest cells.
Since I mentioned Francis Collins, I just remembered another question I want to ask you. I get confused when people talk about theistic evolution. I'm under the impression that theistic evolution means that people believe the process of evolution happened, but that God directed it. But then when somebody says intelligent design, it sounds like the same thing. Where would intelligent design differ from so-called theistic evolution?
Well, it really depends on which meaning of evolution is being affirmed by the theistic evolutionist. The first meaning of evolution, change over time, is something that certainly it's perfectly coherent to merge that with a form of theism. Certainly God can cause change over time. God could also even cause continuous, gradual change over time, though there's increasing evidence that life on Earth did not emerge in a completely gradual way. Where I think the concept of theistic evolution breaks down is when you try to merge theism with the idea of an unguided, undirected process. Not even God can direct an unguided, undirected process, because as soon as God is directing it, it's no longer undirected.
But what? Wouldn't they... but wouldn't... it's kind of like saying, if I roll the dice, right, did God make it, say... snake eyes in this case.
Right.
Or if he didn't, maybe he didn't, but he knew that it would be snake eyes. In other words, couldn't that be the case with theistic evolution? Isn't that what they say? Wouldn't they say that, look, yes, it's random. On one level, it's random, and maybe that's why you objected to the word random earlier, but it's random, but God knew that it would go this way. And you're saying that that's
well, in
not
a sense,
possible?
the key question for theistic evolutionists, and there are forms of theistic evolution that are consistent with intelligent design. If God is directing the evolutionary process to a propitious outcome, that is a form of intelligent design.
Right.
So then the argument is really only over whether that directed form of evolution is continuous or more episodic. Okay, and that's in the metaphysical sense not a really big disagreement, but. What I've been calling for is more clarity in the use of this term, because it can mean so many different things depending on whether we're talking about evolution number 1, 2, or 3, the three meanings that I was talking about.
I guess I'm just fascinated.
And here
one
other key point, though. Many theistic evolutionists are saying that the mutation selection mechanism is God's way of creating.
Right.
And what I show in the book is the mutation selection mechanism has very limited creative power. And so for theists who are looking for a way to harmonize science and faith, this is a losing strategy.
Right.
This is like the Catholic Church backing the Aristotelian cosmology just before Galileo came along. When you have leading secular evolutionary biologists saying that mechanism is of very limited creative power. One quote that I like is a biologist who says that natural selection explains the survival but not the arrival of the fittest. It explains the little stuff, but not the origin of whole new body plans or circuitry or genetic information. And so it to me seems an odd time for the push within the religious world to baptize Darwin and say this is the way God did it, when the scientific establishment is, while not open to a theistic or an ID perspective, is still very much becoming disenchanted with the Darwinian mechanism.
Okay, so you would say that people of faith who are saying that we believe in evolution, this kind of evolution, you're saying that they're backing a loser, and they think it makes them cool, to back this particular loser because they don't think it is a loser. But you're saying that science itself is going to show that this can't work.
Is already increasingly doing so, absolutely, yeah. And
Very
so it is a losing horse, absolutely.
Okay.